Hi everybody, welcome back to Let's Have Tea, my channel about everything. And today I want to talk about what I call the terrible twos, and that is anxiety and depression and how I navigated those. Before I go on, I first of all want to thank everybody who watched my last video about my family and our experience with what would have become a religious cult if the stars aligned. Clearly, you all love a good story, and I'm happy to see that. To be honest, I wasn't expecting that video to do as well as it did. And I'm not saying it did thousands of numbers, but when I looked into my YouTube studio, I think it was on Friday morning, and I was like, it got more than 100 views. I was quite surprised, I'll be honest. So thank you to everybody, and thank you to those who not only watched but also subscribed. And if you watched it and you didn't subscribe, I'm like, why aren't you taking this seriously? Like, why aren't you taking this as seriously as I am? Because this is my project for 2024, like my weekend activity for 2024. So please hit the subscribe button because I do have lots more stories to share and also very random things on my head that I'd just like to get out. But today I want to talk about anxiety and depression for two reasons. The first was a couple of weeks ago, I had uploaded a photo with me and my students when I used to teach back in the day. And in that photo, we all look super happy. And my friend sent me she sent me a message based on that photo and said, "Oh, you look so happy here. You look so beautiful. I really like this photo." And I said, "Thank you." And then I went back and looked at the photo, and I was filled with the memory of how depressed I was in that moment when we took that photo. And it wasn't like I say in that moment, even though the depression wasn't momentous as such, it was more like I was depressed in that season and I just happened to keep functioning. I was not only depressed, I was also very anxious. So when she said, "This is a beautiful photo, da da da," I looked at it and I thought to myself, indeed, when people are depressed, we don't know, right? Like people who are depressed don't show it. And I have a reason or a tendency to believe now that a lot of depressed people often show their personal, like they show a very bubbly personality, and it's not that they're trying to be performative. It's like they're putting in effort to enjoy that moment and to maybe they're also trying to throw people off the scent of the fact that they're depressed, but they tend to be that person. And that was me in that photo. Like you should see, I was like, yeah, super happy, and let's pose here, let's do this and let's do that. The second thing was I met somebody, and this person is amazing. They are fun, they are interesting, great sense of humor, easy to talk to, the whole shebang. But they also confided in me that they have mind numbing anxiety and depression. And so I started thinking to myself, this is something we should talk about. And I know that there are many things out there about how you should navigate your depression, just go to therapy and all that and all that. And I'm not here to say all of that is not true. I just want to share how I dealt with it and what I believe caused it for me. Okay, so I'm not trying to motivate you, so I should probably preface with this. I'm not trying to motivate you. I'm not giving you tools to say, yes, this is what you must do. But I just want to share my experience. And if in the process of that you're motivated and you try something and it works out, that's amazing. But this is not me saying I have the tools and I have the means and I know exactly how you should go about this, because I don't. I honestly don't. So the photo I uploaded is a photo from 2020. It was before the pandemic, because I know a lot of people are like, oh, I've been depressed since the pandemic. I was depressed before the pandemic. I just didn't know it. It was before the pandemic. It was in January. I remember then, what was it? COVID sounded like something that was just happening far away. You know, like with some of the SARS outbreaks that you hear about, it's like, oh, it's just happening somewhere far away. It's never going to get here. I was living in Johannesburg at the time, and I took a trip with 5 of my students around the east coast of South Africa. With some international visitors. So it was like we were having fun, all sciencey stuff. It was really good. But I was very, very unhappy. And I think I had come to a point that particular year where I was at the end of my rope. Now, what led to me having all of these feelings of depression and not being okay? It started off with like, yeah, I started my PhD. When I started my PhD, I was fine. By the time I was finishing it, I was burnt out. So I wasn't depressed during my PhD, but I was burnt out from doing it. As soon as I submitted my thesis and I had to, as soon as I submitted my thesis, not that I had to, I decided to go look for a job. And I got one, thanks to a referral from a friend. I got one at a leadership academy, and there it was like, yeah, we need someone to lead our research program, and we also need someone to teach biology because our biology teachers keep quitting. And biology wasn't my favorite subject, but I was like, I will teach it because I mean, happy to see how to communicate knowledge or translate the knowledge to students in a way that they would understand it. So I took the job, and I was very excited for it. But getting in, I was met with what I would say was a less than ideal environment. It was an environment where you were told what to do, and you were also told how to do it. So it was one of those places where you had to switch off your brain in order to align with what was happening. There was very little creativity allowed in terms of like the things that you could do. So teaching, yeah, you can be creative within teaching, but there were certain things that you had to do before that were, to be honest, unnecessary and quite repetitive. And I remember that one of my first few classes, my manager came to observe me. And after the class, he came to me and said, "Oh, the students seem to love you." And I said, "Oh, that's great." And he said, "Yeah, but just because you've got a PhD doesn't mean you know what you're doing." So it became that space where you knew that microaggressions would thrive, because people just said such things, and they said it so casually that you're caught off guard, but also you quickly realize that fighting against it quickly paints you as like the angry person because it's like you can't take a joke or something weird like that. Anyway, it was that space. So I wasn't feeling okay about the job, I think about a few months in. But I also had this sense of like, this is what, like, it wasn't what I studied for per se, but it was like, this is what I can get now. And I can't really get out of it. So like, let me just keep doing it. I don't know why I had that mentality, but that was my mentality then, that, okay, I've started this thing and I'm in it. So I must just keep doing it. I had a friend also, and she's my closest friend who passed away last year, who also wasn't okay, but she wasn't on the same side as me. She was more like in the corporate side of things, and she would also like express feelings. So I did have somebody to talk to about how I was feeling. But in the wider environment, we didn't have people that we could really express things to because it was just that space where everybody felt like if you criticized something, you were not well aligned with the vision. So I came to a point where it was like I studied for something and I know the kind of independence I had during my PhD. I know how I used my brain on a daily basis, and that was what I enjoyed about it. But coming into this space where I had to switch off my brain, just follow rules, and you can't challenge any rules. If you challenge the rules, you're a problem, started to make me feel like I was not where I should be. Okay. And to be honest, no blame on the workplace at all. The future that I had designed for myself when I was doing my PhD, during my master's, and all of those things was not this kind of workplace. It wasn't that. I had a completely different outcome in mind when I was studying. So the expectation I had of what I would get was a different story. But it was also a time in South Africa where there was a lot of talk rather about foreigners getting jobs. Because I remember I applied for a lecturing position in my department, and they had reached out to me and asked me to send them like some certified copies of some documents. So I assumed they were going to call me for an interview, but they didn't. And my former supervisor later told me, oh no, they had to hire someone who was local, like actually South African. So it was that kind of space. So I was navigating a tumultuous time, if you want to put it that way. But I also still didn't think I was depressed. I also had a lot of thought around like what my future would look like. Like, what would I be doing in the future? Is this it? And the moment I realized this is not it, like I don't want to stay in this workplace, I started to think a lot about what should I be doing to get out of here. And that would send me into these episodes where my heart would be racing. Like it was so bad that sometimes when I was driving into work, my heart would just start racing, and it wasn't out of excitement. It was just that sense of like, you're not doing the right thing. But again, I still didn't think there was anything wrong. Then the pandemic started. Pandemic in South Africa, I think it was the last week of March in 2020, we went into lockdown. And it was such a terrible lockdown in the sense that we were not allowed to move around. Like you couldn't even go on the street for like a couple of months, except you were driving in your car by yourself to the grocery store to pick something and come back home, and that was it. So I didn't see people. It was also a time where at the academy where I was working, there had to be a decision as to whether or not to send the students back home because it was like a boarding academy or keep them on the campus. And the management made a decision to keep them on the campus. And because they did that, they denied us the holiday we would typically get, which is a summer break between June and September or August, thereabout. So we didn't get that summer break. We just kept working all through while the world was falling apart. All of these things culminated in me really realizing that something was wrong. For instance, I would sometimes just sit in front of the TV and I'd feel like, ugh, my life doesn't make any sense. I don't know what I'm doing with myself. And I'd become really depressed and I'll start crying. But again, I wasn't considering it as depression. I was just thinking I was just sad because I wasn't seeing people. I could speak to people over the phone. I could do all that, but things were just not adding up. Eventually, I decided to call a therapist. Like, and I got to that point where I was like, I don't really understand myself. I have all these episodes where I'm totally scared of what could happen to me, and I just don't feel like I'm doing the right thing. So I decided to call a therapist. And I remember my first conversation with her was over the phone for like 10 minutes. It wasn't a session. It was just me talking, and she was asking me why I needed therapy. And I was explaining to her, well, I feel this way and I don't know, there's something up with my job. Like, I feel like it's making me depressed because every time I talk about it with people, it's usually negative things and I can't really find the positive. Something is wrong. And she said to me, it sounds to me like you're very anxious. So you should come in for a session. I have like a physical distancing thing. At that time, South Africa had made a law that you could go out and as long as you can socially distance from each other. So I started therapy. And it was through that I started to understand what anxiety meant and what depression meant. So, anxiety. Anxiety, the way I understand it, is either born from the sense of not being good enough, which in a way was what I was experiencing at that time. The sense of not being good enough in an environment where where it was like, there are certain opinions that were valuable in that environment and certain kinds of people that we ascribed value, and other people's opinions were considered to be worthless. And I happen to be one of those people because I remember even being told that my PhD just didn't count for my income or anything like that. Like, it was one of those places. So there was a sense of like you're trying to prove yourself all the time. Like, I mean, when your manager says to you, you don't know what you're doing, it doesn't mean you know what you're doing even though you have a PhD. You get to a point where you're like, I need to prove myself. I need to really show that I know what I'm doing. So I was going to work with this sense all the time. Like, I needed to make sure I did things properly and make sure I got the results and da 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 da. There was that. So there's a sense of anxiety that comes from, I'm not good enough for this. Like, so I need to keep proving myself. And that means you never really enjoy being in the moment. And this was explained to me. And to be honest, I could relate because I was like, I totally get that. And the other bit is where you're just so worried about your future, and it's sort of tied to not being good enough as well. But you are so tied to the idea of a perfect future that you just don't stop at any point in time to sit in the moment. Like, it's not about you. Sometimes you're not even trying to like prove yourself continuously. It's more like, I don't know what I'm doing with myself. I feel incapable. And I can't think of my future. I can't make plans for the future. And so every time you're just like in that state. You're always in a future state of mind and never in the present. So that was anxiety. Depression was a whole different story. And I was lucky in the sense that my therapist quickly picked on the fact that I am not a depressed person perpetually. I just happen to be in a depressed state. And that was because we started to talk about my job, we started to talk about my life and my decisions. And it came out to two things. The first was that up until that point, and if you've watched some of my videos, I'm pretty sure you're already aware of this. Up until that point, I had made decisions on the basis of a programming I received as a child that I had to do the most difficult things and choose things even if they didn't necessarily align with me in order to prove myself, right? And if I did those difficult things, they would lead to certain desired results. So for example, when I was doing my master's in engineering, I attended a conference where there was a strengths coach. I've said this story before. And that strengths coach came to me after I did my strengths test result and was trying to coach me. And he asked me, what are you working in now? What sector are you in? And I said, oh, I'm in engineering. And I was very excited about this because you know how it is when you're like, oh, I'm an engineer. Everybody's like, ooh. So it's like, I'm in engineering. And I remember he said to me, you are in the wrong field. And I thought, this man is crazy because at that time, actually that week, I had gotten my results from my master's and I was graduating with a distinction. So why would it not be for me? Like, obviously, I'm excelling at it. But he was like, it is not the field for you based on what your strength profile shows. Okay? You should really consider what might be the best for you. And at that time, I didn't realize that there's a difference between what you're good at because you work hard at it and what you are just good at because it aligns with your strengths. I am good at engineering, math, and whatever because I am not afraid of thinking of a complex problem. Okay? I don't mind working hard on a complex problem. But do you know what I'm actually really good at naturally is thinking about a complex problem, which could be anything, doesn't have to be engineering. And I know those two things sound really wild, but I hope they make sense. So he was like, you should really think about this. And I just thought, this man is wild. He's being crazy. I don't have to do this, whatever. And these tests are never real anyway. I will tell you something. In this job I finally had after my PhD, I had told one of my colleagues who also happens to be a strengths coach. She had been trained on it. I told her, oh, these were my test results. And she's like, yep, those look accurate. That seems like you. And that made me reflect on what that man said. Anyway, point is, I grew up with a dad who was very like, he wants a scientist child. And I was that scientist child. And he had very high expectations. I still have high expectations. And I think I just kept doing things based on that voice in my head of like, you need to do these difficult things. And I never really questioned whether science was for me. Like right from when I was a child, it just seemed like, yeah, you must go into science. There was never a time when I thought to myself, maybe I would like law, or maybe I would like something commercial, something like economics, something along those lines. I just didn't have that presence of mind to do that until I was much older. So I was in this state where I had lived my life doing all these things with the expectation that they would take me to a life that I desired. And when you ask me the life that I desired, it was not a life with a hard hat. I didn't want to wear a hard hat. And if I wore one, for me, it was just like maybe I'm popping in and popping out. It wasn't like, yes, I'm wearing a hard hat every single day. I'm wearing safety shoes. That wasn't what I dreamt of when I was dreaming of my life in the future. But now I get to this future, I neither have a hard hat or the life I was dreaming of. And I certainly was in a place where I just couldn't be myself. Like I couldn't use my brain. I had to switch off my brain. And if there's one way to frustrate me in this life, it is to put me in a position where I can't use my brain. Like just tell me, where you're just giving me orders and you're telling me do this, go here, go there, go from A to B, back from B to A. That is the easiest way to frustrate me. So anyway, I get there. So I'm explaining all of this rather to my therapist. And she then said, okay, it sounds like the cause of your depression might be that you're living a life that you don't want to live, but you are not brave enough or you're not present enough to say that this life is not for me. You're still building castles on this life. It's like when you already have a foundation for a particular type of building and you just keep building on it. You just keep building on it. You never stop to ask yourself, do I even like this building? Because if I don't like it, I should just uproot the foundation and just go elsewhere. Or like, if the foundation is still fine, I can just like take off some things and rebuild it. I wasn't doing that. So when she and I had that conversation, it became very clear to me that I had to make a big change. Like I had to do a big reset in my life in order to understand, in order to get myself out of the depressed state. That big change ended up being moving countries and also changing my career, which I did all between 2021 and 2022. Okay. I decided the price I had to pay was to go back to school, study policy, which is something I really enjoy and allows me to think about complex problems, allows me to solve them, but also gives me the human relationship that I was missing in engineering. Because it wasn't that I sucked at engineering, it was the fact that there was no human element to it. And even when I wrote my thesis, I wrote it with a human angle, right? Like I was very like human focused when I was writing it. And I think that was where it became really clear to me as well. Like, okay, something, because I did go back during therapy. I went back and I was like looking at all the things I had done. And it was like, yeah, I've always craved that human element and high level decision making, which is what policy allows me to do. So I went back and I did all of that. But what I'm trying to bring out here is that for me, what was very clear was that depression is the difference between, or for me, it was the difference between the expectations I had when I was doing all those difficult things, trudging down the road of a PhD. The expectation I had was a completely different life from what the reality was. This only occurred to me like after I had left therapy, like a year later. And I thought of it like a graph. So if you have like an XY axis and you were to plot a line for expectation and then you plotted the line for reality and it went in a different direction and there was a huge gap between those two, then the chances are that you will be unhappy. If there's too much of a gap between your expectations and your reality, you will be unhappy. It's hard to escape. And the moment I realized that, I started to make changes. I'm going to come back to anxiety. I just want to dwell a little bit on depression for a bit. Because depression is like a perpetual state of, I don't want to call it unhappiness, but it's a perpetual state of loss of self, if I can put it that way, where you feel separate from your life, you feel separate from yourself. The life you're living doesn't feel like your own. And I don't mean that in a good way, because there's sometimes when wonderful things happen and you're like, oh, is this my life? Like, oh my God. But there are times things happen, or like you're in a situation where you're like, this can't be my life. Like, I refuse it. And that was me. That was me. I was in this job. I didn't hate the job, but I didn't like the environment. And then I was in this state where it was like I did all this work, studied hard for all these things, but it seems like I can't reap the rewards. I was unhappy. It seemed like all the decisions I made up until that point did not make any sense. So there was just a whole lot of things coming together, and working against me. But when I started to think of it as that graph, and it all started with a friend who sent me a message to say, oh, you should just manage, like you should reduce the gap between your expectations and your reality. My head saw it as a graph. So I guess thanks, math, engineering, whatever. And I was like, yeah, actually, if I had these two lines and they collided at some point, that would be the state of ultimate happiness, where my expectations and my reality actually met with each other. That's perhaps what ultimate happiness is. But how do I fix it? Because I had a big gap. Now, some people might say you should change your reality, or you should pray about it, and you should do all of that. I was doing all that, okay? I was doing all that. Nobody's saying don't pray. But what I did was I asked myself, what is the variable? And I know this is becoming a bit of a sciencey speak. What is the variable that I am able to change? Okay, what is the variable that I am able to mess with here? And that variable for me was my expectations. I got to a point where I had to tell myself to stop expecting the outcome. And I know this sounds very weird, because when you talk about expectations, even I have an acronym in my head for HOPE, which is having only positive expectations. People say you can't live without expectation, and they are right. Okay? But I'll explain exactly what I am trying to say here. I stopped having expectations of things in the sense that I stopped planning for them to work out in a certain way. So let me explain it this way. I can play the lottery, okay? And obviously I can hope to win the lottery, which by the way I do, because I'm like, oh, this is so exhausting. I need to win the lottery. So I can play the lottery and I can hope I win. But I cannot plan my life around the idea that I will win the lottery, because winning the lottery is not something that has happened. It's not reality, okay? It's an expectation that I have. So I can't hedge my reality on that expectation. I can't say, Well, I bought a ticket yesterday, so I am now going to call a real estate agent for this house that I absolutely love and tell them that I will be there next week to buy it. Okay? Because I don't know what the outcome of playing the lottery is going to be. The moment I thought about it that way, I stopped expecting things. Rather, I focused on just working on them. So, say for example, when I was planning for my policy program, and I said, okay, I've decided I'm going to change my career, I'm going to go and study public policy. I was like, okay, I'm going to apply to all the universities that I'm interested in, but I will not attach any sense of like, this is definitely happening to all those applications. Rather, I will go and get another job. So I told myself, the first thing my therapist made very clear to me was, you've stayed in this job that you hate all by your own doing. Nobody has trapped you there. Nobody has tied your leg to the doorpost. You decided that you couldn't find anything else. But perhaps if you had tried, you would have found something. So the moment we had that discussion and I realized, to be honest, nobody tied me here. Yes, I signed a contract, but I can leave the contract. And there are people who've left before me who started the same day I did. The moment I had that decision in my head, I told myself, okay, because it's the pandemic and I need some time to look, and my contract is expiring soon, I will not renew my contract regardless of what happens. I'm going to leave this job. Okay? There's nothing that's going to take me back. I will figure out my life. Whatever. And please, I'm not saying go quit your job. Please, do not quit your job. There's a recession on the way. Do not do that. But I'm saying that's what I thought at that time, that I was just going to quit my job. I'd find something else and leave that environment. And in terms of like applying to go study policy, the idea was, I am not expecting anything per se from here. What I can control is apply for another job, get something, and send in applications for these policy programs, and then just wait. Living my life that way has changed a lot of things for me. It has helped me, first of all, bring my expectations much closer to what my reality is. Because when I put effort into things, since then, it's always like I'm putting in my best effort. I'm not just putting effort because it's like, oh, well, I just need to do this. I don't really care about it. No, I will put in my best effort. But I also have it at the back of my mind that even though this is my best effort, it's not necessarily the best effort to secure this thing. And this thing might not work out. And if it doesn't work out, what am I doing currently that just keeps me as I am or helps me move forward a little bit more? So not having very lofty expectations, but still doing my best, has helped me close that gap between expectation and reality. And I think it has reduced my depressive episodes quite significantly, because my therapist, again, she said, you are not a depressed person based on my assessment, because we had to do an assessment on my first day, but you are going through a depressive state that we need to get you out of very quickly. And that became the way I got out of it. Walking around my expectations and being very aware of my reality. I want to digress a little bit here to say that religion also played a role in how I managed my expectations before I came to this new way of approaching them, in the sense that I grew up with the understanding that whatever it is that you pray for, you will always get. And sometimes in my own reality, there are things that I prayed for that I did not get. And you can have 1,001 reasons for those things. But what was happening is that it was also eroding my faith. It was affecting how I was living my life and what I saw, how I was beginning to view my relationship with God. Like it was playing a role there. So just saying, like, have that at the back of your mind, because sometimes you can be so attached to a specific outcome that it's all you pray about, it's all you think about. And when it doesn't happen, you become really disappointed. Even in the Bible, it says hope deferred makes the heart sick. You become really disappointed, you become really disillusioned, and you just can't get out of it. So for me, it was that sense of like, I'm going to do my best. I'm going to be grateful for the things I have in my reality. And I'm going to keep my expectations as close to my reality as possible, just so that I don't have a gap that then leads to me being disappointed and unhappy. But then, what did I do about anxiety? Because I was also very anxious. I knew South Africa was becoming increasingly xenophobic. And again, I know South Africans themselves don't like to use the word, they don't like it when the word xenophobia is used to describe them. So maybe that's not fair or fair use of word, but it was becoming increasingly hostile to foreigners in the sense that there were policies that were being put in place that sort of like made it difficult to just navigate life as a legal foreigner, not someone who's illegal. Like even as someone who was legal, you've got all the papers. There were like things about like universities should not hire foreign professors and da da da, and all of these things were sort of flying under the radar. So I knew for sure that I didn't want to be there, and I was very anxious about it. I was very scared about what my future would look like because I was a permanent resident. I'd lived there for a very long time, and I just didn't know what to do. And I remember my therapist said you can either take medication or you can start to manage how present you are in the moment. Again, it's sort of attached to being depressed. When you are depressed, and it's basically due to like your expectations versus your reality, like they're not matching up, there's a big gap between them. You become really anxious about that gap. Okay, like yeah, you're disillusioned about it. It's like this is where I thought I would be, but I'm here and I'm very unhappy. But you also become anxious thinking about how do I move from here to where the expectation is? How do I reach the ideal state that I have conjured in my mind? And that was where I was. It was like, oh my God, I'm in this space and I want to get to a higher state. How do I get there? How do I do this? How do I do that? So the first thing that I had to learn to start doing was to sit in the moment. And that was a difficult thing because my mind, like I was a person who was like, my mind has to always be busy with something. Like I was basically making myself anxious in some way. And I will say that there are things that still make me anxious. I don't think the anxiety is completely gone. I even tell my sister, like when she's like, oh, Demi, I need something from you now. I'm like, please don't do this because when you ask for things from me immediately, you're making me anxious and I don't like it. So it's not something that's completely gone, but it's something that I have learned to manage. And the first thing was sit in the moment and think about where you are, what you have, and how you got there. So there are times when I would sit in the chair and we would talk about my journey from the past, like the things I had already achieved and how I got there. And I started to realize that my life wasn't as bad as I thought. Like there were so many things that I pursued and I made through. Like I made it through them no matter how difficult they were because somehow they just worked out for me, right? Like so there was no reason for me to be scared about my future if these things I hoped for in the past worked out. That was the first thing. Second thing was I had to start meditating. And she was very clear about this. Like being able to just lie down, and my meditation is not even active meditation where I'm like sitting in a particular state, and sometimes it was just be me lying down in a room that's dark, cold, and I would just let my mind travel to wherever it wanted to travel to, and I would stay on that thought and think about how it affects me. Like I would think about what I am thinking about. And I don't think this is something that we are taught enough because anxiety really gets you going. Like you can become anxious. It's like a rabbit hole. The moment you get into it, it's sort of hard to climb out of it. Once you get into that anxious state, you're constantly like, what's the next thing? You're like a rabid rabbit in some way where you're just like, oh God, I just want to get more of it. But my therapist would say to me, when you have a thought like that and you're running down a rabbit hole, you need to pause and ask yourself, why am I thinking about this? Why am I thinking what I am thinking? And the moment I started to do that, I did notice that I would get better at interrupting an anxious thought, which was what she was trying to get me to do because sometimes I can't stop an anxious thought from coming on, but I can interrupt it by asking myself why I'm thinking about it. And the moment I ask myself that question, my mind starts to give me the answers. Oh, you're thinking about this because you think that you're not doing well enough here, or you're thinking about this because of something somebody said, which is not necessarily true. And so that way it just sort of like became a thing that I started to work on until I got to a state where I can now manage my anxiety, and I'm now in a state where my expectations are, I don't want to say my expectations are low because that's not it. Because I know when people say things like have low expectations, it seems negative in a way. It seems as though they're saying plan for lower quality outcomes in your life. But that's not what it is at all. And I wish I had a better way of explaining this. And I want to dwell on it a little bit more. It is more the sense of put out your effort as much as you can, put as much effort as you can, rather, into whatever you wish to see happen. But do not tie yourself to an expected outcome. Do not tie yourself to, don't tie your identity, your reality to an expected outcome. Because if that outcome doesn't happen, you will be depressed. You'll be depressed. And I'm not saying that this is the cause for everybody's depression, because I realize that for some people, depression is a state of isolation as well. And like I said earlier, it's a loss of self. And for me, what I had to start doing to address that part, because I did feel like I was losing myself. Before the pandemic, I enjoyed cooking. I enjoyed working out. I used to lift weights. And it was just really like, I was very happy. I would even take people on like their first like workout session. It would be like, yeah, let's burn it up. Let's do all of that. When the pandemic happened and I couldn't do all of that, it felt like I was a little bit separate from myself. I couldn't see people. My friend Dudu and I would have all these video calls where we would chat with each other, and like we sort of like made it through the pandemic really slowly. Um, but I think coming out of it, and I'm just thinking about the fact that Dudu is dead now, so that just, yeah. But coming out of it, I'm sorry. Coming out of it, I started to like be deliberate about how I was spending my time. And so I've had to like be deliberate about signing up for things like, okay, I'm going to take a swimming class, and I'm going to go to the gym, and I'm going to go to a French class, and I'm going to do all of these things. And when I meet people, I'm interested in getting to know them and asking them questions and all of that jazz and all that. And also thinking about the fact that sometimes your depression might not show up the way that you think. It might just show up as exhaustion, or as you just continuously scrolling mindlessly on your phone. So you might find yourself like, and sometimes I do it where I just starfish and I'm just like scrolling mindlessly on my phone. So one of my things was, I need to find something that would stop me from doing this. And what's that thing? It could be I'm reading, or I'm going to watch something on TV, or I'm going to try a new recipe, or I'm going to take a walk, or I'm just going to have a phone call with a friend, just so that I don't get myself in that state where I am experiencing loss of self, like where I'm like, it's just me, I feel isolated, it's just me, I'm dealing with this by myself. And so yeah, those are things that sort of helped me. Now, do I think that those things work for everybody? I don't think that they would work for everybody. I don't think that what I experienced was hectic depression. Like I said, it was just like I was in a depressive state, and I've been taught to notice when it might come on and address it very quickly. um, but I do feel like those strategies helped me a lot. Like, and I mean, I hope that they would help somebody, to be honest, because when I meet people who are depressed, it like for me it feels like a loss, if you catch my drift. Like it feels like it's a loss to the rest of the people around them, because these are usually like very lovely, kind people who have a lot to live for, who have a lot to look forward to, but they just can't see it. And on that note, I also just want to add that when I was going through this depressive state, I couldn't see my future anymore in South Africa. And I need to explain this to people, because I didn't know that that was a sign that I was depressed. I saw it as a sign of, oh, the economy is a bit weird. I'm in a job I don't like, and my pay is not what I want it to be. That was how I was seeing it. But when I was talking to my therapist, and she was like, oh, when you first moved back to Johannesburg, because I used to live outside Cape Town, what were the things that you thought you would do? And I was telling her all these things, like, oh, I'd hoped I'd buy this, and I'd have this, and I'll do that, and I'll establish this and that. And then she said, okay, do you still feel like you want to do those things? And I said, you know what? I had the opportunity to do one of those things recently, and it would have been a big deal if I made it happen. But I could not bring myself to see it happening. I went to the place, I saw the thing, I was supposed to be like, yes, okay, I'm going to do it. But I just left and said, no, I can't. So sometimes depression also shows up in this sense of like, you can no longer see what's ahead. And that means you might need a big reset, which was what I did. Again, like I did a big reset, and I'm glad it worked out. Doesn't always work out for everybody. But I just find that having a big reset is always a good idea. to maybe find your ideal life. Maybe travel around a bit, because I also did that. When I was burnt out, I went to Tunisia for a week, and that helped me a lot. So travel around a bit, think about the things that you're doing and what you would like to do. And if you can't see the future anymore in a certain state, then it means that you might have come to a point where you need to ask yourself, where do I want to be and what do I need to do to get there? And yeah, that's it from me. I don't have any other things that I want to share, but I hope that this sort of helps you understand that being depressed is a hard thing for those who are experiencing it. Being anxious is also really difficult, and anxiety is numbing. People think anxiety is only that sense of having a racing heart, but it's not just that. Sometimes you can be numb with anxiety. You can't move, you can't think of anything else. And even when you try other things, it just doesn't work out. And sometimes for those who feel like their anxiety or their depression came out of the pandemic, I think the best thing that I can think of is that there might need to be some deliberate effort to make it out into the world again. There might be some deliberate effort to reintroduce yourself into the world in a different way. So, for example, before the pandemic, I was a weightlifter and I used to do all these hectic workouts and all of that. After the pandemic, when I had an opportunity to go back to the gym, I realized that my body did not like the weightlifting anymore. And I had to be kind to myself. Thankfully, my therapist had poured a lot into my head about how I had to listen to myself and prioritize my own voice and not really think about meeting the expectations that are set for me outside, which is something I'm just going to speak about very briefly after this point. But rather, I should prioritize what I am thinking, what I am feeling, and how my body is responding to things. So when I got into the gym and I was like, okay, I want to get back to my weightlifting, I can do this, I can do 45 squats with 50 kilos and all that drama, my body wasn't having it. So I've had to redesign my entire workout. And I find that now I enjoy cardio workouts more. And that's okay. Someone might be like, oh, you're not going to build a gym body. I'm not trying to build a gym body. I'm just trying to be healthy. And that's what's most important. The other thing I wanted to say about the expectations, I just touched on it and it sort of popped into my head, is that sometimes the lives that we are living, just like I was, are for other people. We are living other people's lives. We're not living our own lives. We are looking for other people's admiration in some way or their validation. So we keep making decisions that will fit into that pipeline. We're like, oh, if I do this, then people will see me as this. And we don't necessarily do it consciously. Like when I was making all my choices, it wasn't the sense of, I know when I do this, this person's going to call me and they're going to say this, and then that will make me feel this way. No, but it's an unconscious system in the brain that keeps saying, if you do this, then you're likely to get this or you're likely to get that. And so we stick with what I call a script that's been written for us, in the sense that other people have said, this is how you should be, and this is how you should be, and this is how you should be. And you sort of stick with that, and you keep playing that script your entire life, and you never pause to ask, is this even a character that I would like to play? So that's something else to bear in mind as to something that might make you disillusioned with your life and increase the gap between your expectations and your reality, and also just increase the gap between your dreams and your reality. I think that's also another way to put it, not just the expectations, even just the dreams that you have. Like when you close your eyes and you see yourself in the future, is the person you are working towards today, or the person you're putting effort in today, going to become the person that you're dreaming about? If the answer is yes, I'm on the right track, what I'm doing now is likely. Of course, again, don't tie yourself to a specific outcome. So you have to be speaking in statistical terms here. If the person I'm putting effort into is highly likely to become the person I dream about, then you're great. If the person you are putting effort into today is misaligned, I was putting effort into an engineer and I did not want to wear a hat at. I wanted to wear heels. I wanted to be girly girly. So obviously those two were never going to meet. And I was going to stay disillusioned for the rest of my life if I did not decide randomly during the pandemic to just apply for a policy program and see what would happen. And when it worked out, I was so shocked. But anywho, that's all I have today. And thank you for joining me for this rather long rant about the terrible twos. I hope that you have a great week ahead, and I'll see you on the next video. Goodbye.